Better. I'm going to start over again. Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming and staying. My name is Mitchell Bard. I am the panel moderator for this the screenwriting panel for this year's why can't I speak? This year's screenwriting panel. My background in screenwriting is that I was a filmmaker. I in fact had the opening night film of this festival 22 years ago, Mergers and Acquisitions. I went on, I worked in development. I was the head of development for Snapper Films, and I even worked in distribution. I was the head of acquisitions for Film Thread DVD. I'm now a college professor at Iona University, where I teach several things, including filmmaking and screenwriting. With us today, we have a screenwriter, a published novelist, an award-winning director, editor, and composer, Stevan Mena. Mena? Yeah. I'm sorry. Steven has had films at this festival as well. Have all the films been at this festival, or some of them?
I've had 3 at this festival, and all 3 won.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So 3 winning films at this festival. Steven wrote, produced, directed, edited, and composed the score for all of those films, and they were distributed theatrically worldwide by Anchor Bay and Lionsgate. So these are successful films. He gave starts to some actors that names you might even recognize, like Alexandra Daddario and Peyton List. And he even wrote a novel, Transients, which has been published and in several languages in several countries. So thank you so much, Steven, for joining us on the panel this year. He knows a thing or two about screenwriting. So
let me just ask, if you guys are all interested in the panel, why don't you move closer? You guys are so far away, and this way we don't have to yell.
Yeah,
it's making a more intimate thing.
Thank you. And I apologize, we don't have microphones this year. They're having technical
we got lots of seats up here, so they're all.
Was a college professor, I'm used to have one sitting in the back. So, and what I usually like to start out with on this panel is talking about is how hard it is to develop an idea into a screenplay. So Steven, you are someone who's written many successful screenplays. What is your process when you have an idea of something that you want to pursue? How do you develop that into an actual script?
Well, the first thing I do is I try to forget about it. And if it keeps coming back to me, then I'll pursue it. So I have a lot of ideas, like so many screenwriting ideas that I don't pursue, because if I did, I'd never get anything done. So for me, it's all about distilling, like, what is the idea that I think would work as a film, and how can I focus my energy on just that, that story, and shut out all the other noise. And so the way I do that is I have all these stories in my head, and the one that keeps floating to the surface is the one that I start writing down. And that's how I start the process. And then for me, it's more about, it's very important for me to start outlining things, to have like a beginning, middle, and end before I start, to know where I'm going. It's really important to know how my film's going to end, so I know all the things that need to lead to that end. And that also sometimes informs the beginning. So I like to know all my beats and all my pieces before I actually sit down and start to flesh it all out. I've actually taken one of my scripts and taken it to the next level. The script, the book Transients, started out as a screenplay. And so I went through the entire process and then took that screenplay and then went further and embellished it into a full novel. But you really have to start with just distilling the idea that you think is not only something that you'd really want to spend a lot of time with, but also you think is going to be something that could be sellable, commercial, and something that people actually want to watch.
So I think there are a couple things I think we should talk more about it, because I think you made some really important points that we can expand on. So the first thing you said was how long it takes you to select the idea that you will develop into a screenplay, that there are many others that never make it to that level. And I think that's something that's really, really important. So for you, you said it's mainly that it's the thing you can't stop thinking about?
Yeah, it's the one where as I go through it, it inspires me, right? Like I'll think about it, and the ideas keep coming. Like there's so many other ideas where like I'll get to like maybe page 30 in my head. I'm like, where do I go from here? But the one idea where I feel like I can kind of circuit all the way to the end, and I know all the beats, and it inspires me to want to work on it, because it's very hard to write anything. You know, especially for me, I don't know about other people, but for me, it's like blood from a stone to sit down and write. It doesn't come easy for me, so I have to really push myself, you know, get up each morning and to, you know, sit in front of the computer. You know, it doesn't just happen. You know, it's hard work. You know, and for me, for whatever reason, it's really tough to squeeze those ideas out onto the page. So I think it's really important for me to have something that really inspires me to want to get up and do that. You know, and there's very few of those. I have like hundreds of ideas that I've sifted through and kind of, you know, I keep them around, but I don't expand on them because they just don't inspire me.
I think that's a really important point, that I think people jump too quickly into their topics sometimes, and you learn the hard way if it's not fleshed out, if it doesn't have potential to really be a full screenplay with a full character development.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many people who tell you, oh, you can write a screenplay in 3 days or a week or a month, but that's all, yeah, you can, but it won't be good, right? If you want something really good, you're gonna struggle with it for months or years, right? To do something that's real quality work. And so you gotta think about that. You gotta take all this, you won't think about it until you've done it for 10 years. And then you'll be like, shit, I wasted all this freaking time on all these stories that went nowhere. So now, before I do that, I'm going to sit for a few hours or a few days or a few weeks with this idea, sit with it, and see if it really inspires me. And then I'm going to start. Because otherwise, you go down this road that could take 2 years of your life and completely waste it on something that's never going to come to fruition. So that's what I'm saying as far as, like, you know, distilling all of your ideas into something that's you know, that you're passionate about, right?
I think you said that people say you can write a screenplay in a couple of days and everything. I think I remember about 25 years ago, I was at one of these like screenwriting events where they had speakers, and this screenwriter named Preston Whitmore, who had a lot of scripts sold at that point, a lot of movies out there, said that he used to go into his room and write for 48 hours straight, and that's how he got the scripts. And when you hear him speak, you can see he's a super smart guy. That's the most dangerous thing to tell a room full of screenwriters, because just because he is this freakish talent who can go into a room and 48 hours later produce a producible screenplay.
But let me call bullshit on that.
Okay.
What's actually happened is he's been thinking about this idea for a really long time, and he has fleshed out all the beats in his head. And then when he had it all in his head, and maybe he's got a photographic memory, or maybe he's just really intelligent, like you said, he's got it all in his head, and then he goes in and sits down for 48 hours and writes it all out. It didn't come to him in that 48 hours. He didn't struggle with all the, this goes here and this goes there, and this character's arc is this, and this is that, and this ends this way, and this dovetails back to that. He didn't do all that in the 48 hours. He had already done that. He just then wrote it down.
One would hope.
Unless he's like Mozart.
That's what I'm saying. But even if you have it all planned out, you shouldn't be writing it in 48 hours. You know what I mean? This is a process, I think, for most. It's okay for him, but I'm saying for a room full of people and for these people, like, I don't think that's an example for people to follow. I think it's a bad example for people to follow.
Yeah.
And the next thing you said that really stood out to me was the idea of knowing the beginning, middle, and the end, you know, before you start. And I also sit with an idea for a long time before I start writing about it. And when I think I'm going to start developing something, the first thing I try and write out, and literally write out on the computer, not in my head or whatever, is, I know it's very old-fashioned, but I kind of, even if it's the most crazy indie film, it doesn't matter. I kind of want to generally know what are the 5 beats or the 5 point, you know, of a traditional thing. I want to, like, what's the inciting incident? What is the first act climax? What is the midpoint climax? What is the second act climax? And what is the third act climax? And then on. I kind of want to know that, because if I can write those 5 things out, then I now have a skeleton to hang a movie on. Do you get that specifically?
100%. Yeah. It's important to know the intention of your characters, and so that whatever actions you have them do throughout the script has to be informed by, you know, your awareness of where this is going.
Yeah.
Unless you're Stephen King and you just write with no plan and no, you know, he says he writes with no plan and no outline, which again, it's all bullshit. It's all stuff that you tell the media, but that's not true. It's not the way it works.
And I would say, again, there are outliers in life, you know what I mean? So to whatever extent he's doing that, that's not an example for us.
I'm sure he did it once, but...
That too, yeah. So I thought that was interesting. And then the next thing you said was about outlines. So how much do you outline scene by scene before you write?
I outline up to the point where I don't put in dialogue. I'll do everything but dialogue. So usually my outlines are about 10 pages long, and then when I expand them with dialogue, it becomes 90 pages. But I try to put in as much detail as I can, and but it's very free form. Like, I don't outline traditionally. I outline I spitball ideas, and I put them into chunks of where they can happen, why they happen, and what happens because of that, right? And so I'll have like almost like a flow chart that I'll do. So it's not really like a 10-page Word document. It is more of just like a spaghetti of all my ideas, just kind of strung together.
And then how do you use that when you sit down to write?
It's really something where I just kind of reference back. Like, if I always say to myself, if I have to look at it, then maybe this is not the right story to write.
Oh, interesting.
So I put it there just to have it, and then I write. And then occasionally, like I'll be like, what was that one idea? Where did I put that idea? Let me just take a quick peek, and I'll do that. But if I have to sit there and read through the whole thing, then it's not in my head, and it's really not interesting. If it's interesting, I don't need to look at it.
Interesting. That is a powerful kind of way of looking at it. Okay, so then when you have a draft, what is your process for moving forward with that draft? Do you have ways of for lack of a better word, testing it, or what do you do?
Usually the first draft I won't show anybody, because there's a rhythm to storytelling, and you can't get the rhythm on the first draft. It's like a road. You got to smooth it out. And so what I'll do is I'll take the first draft and I'll go through it again, and I'll try to consolidate things and fix things and smooth things out, so that there's that rhythm of storytelling. So that, because it's like when you take a movie before the music is put in, and has been done, and you show it to somebody, they'll be like, this is terrible. It's not a movie. Because what music and the sound mix does is it smooths out all the holes and the cracks, and it creates this cohesion of storytelling that when you watch it, you don't get pulled in and out of the movie. Because even just like a dip in sound between two cuts, you'll be like, oh, that was horrible. This movie sucks, right? It's amazing the power that the music and all that has. And it's the same thing with writing. If you don't take that chunk of dialogue and distill it down to the salient points that you need and get rid of all the rest, someone's going to read that and be like, oh, this is boring. Yeah, I don't like this, right? So you get rid of all that stuff, then you show it to somebody. Smooth everything out, so that this way when they read it, they're not distracted by all that nonsense, and they can really get into the story itself, and then give you feedback based on the idea, the story, not on all the bullshit. Be like, well, on this page here, you've got this run-on sentence, and this, I would never have a character say that. So, like, take all that stuff out, if you can, because you don't want people commenting on that stuff. You want them saying, you know what, in the third part of the story, the third act, I don't think she would have shot him. I think she would have spared his life, or whatever. Have them comment on that part of it, not on the grammar and all that stuff.
I think that's, from all of the angles of my life that I've been around film, I think that is the most underrated mistake that people make. If you cannot write your script in a manner that isn't littered with typos, that is clear and easy for the reader to understand, that's written in decent grammar, that's written with clarity, then you're going to lose the reader. And remember, when you go through the development process, whether it's a formal development process like you're submitting it to a production company or a studio to read it, or if you're trying to indie do it and you're trying to convince people to work with you, or convince people to finance it, or convince actors to be in it, it is so easy. People are looking for reasons to dismiss a script, right? Because it's hard. Because if you say, I like this, I want to work on it, or I want to fund it, or I want to develop it, that means you're setting yourself up for a lot of work. Right?
Well, I'll tell you what the reader does if you do submit it to a company and they read it. The reader is so used to reading scripts that they not only know what to look for, but they know the ones that have been sweat over, right? They'll look at your script and be like, if this guy can't even spend 5 minutes going through and fixing these typos, he hasn't really reread this script 100 times. And I want you to fucking reread this 100 times before you send it to me. I want to know that you slaved over this before it got to me. Because if I don't feel that, I'm going to discard it. And stupid mistakes about like grammar and formatting, yeah, they're gonna throw it away immediately because they know that you're not really trying hard enough.
And 100%. And it's like there's the old famous story that Van Halen, when they went on tour, required that all the brown M&Ms be taken out of the M&Ms in their green room. And everyone always took that as a story of the pretentious rock stars. But I have a friend who, it's exactly right. Did you hear what she said? It's like, I have a friend who's a musician who has riders like that, and he doesn't do the M&Ms. But he asked for a very specific bottle of vodka to be with the stuff. And he knows when he gets there, if the vodka is there, the people are on top of things and they're paying attention. If the vodka is not there, is the security right? Is the sound right? Right? And you start. The same thing goes for these screenplays.
Well, I thought they were pretentious dicks. I had no idea. Look, you've changed my whole.
You're missing the point that it could be both. It could be both. But the same that rule applied to me when I had 10, 15 scripts on my desk that I knew I had to get through. And if I opened up the first page and I saw a sea of non-paragraphed out action text, and I'm reading things that are not possible to show on screen. John grew up in a poor family and didn't know how he was going. You can't show that on screen. This is not a novel, right? That would be enough for me to say next, because I know that if this isn't in place, the odds of there being a well-crafted story with well-crafted characters and realistic dialogue that's not expositional is not going to be there, right? So it's kind of like the brown M&Ms or the bottle of fancy vodka, right? Like I would know, and it's easy to dismiss. So I think that's really, that understanding the craft of writing a screenplay is as important as the actual writing of the screenplay.
Yeah, and obviously you have to have a good story, and the reader wants to know that you're in control from page one. So to not take the precaution of making sure that all those other things are in place, I mean, why not? Those are the easy things. Writing a good story is the hard part. That stuff's the easy part.
Yeah, making sure that you don't have more than 4 or 5 lines in a row of action without a paragraph break.
Yeah.
Making sure you're only putting in the action lines what can be seen on screen.
Yeah.
Things like this.
And the way to learn that is just to read other screenplays.
Absolutely.
That's it. Just read other screenplays, see how the other guys are doing it, other successful people are doing it, and just it's like anything, like building a house. Like there's a blueprint. So it doesn't mean that you can deviate from that, but there's certain ways that things are done, and people are going to expect that, and they'll appreciate it when you do it the right way.
And what's interesting is, when I started learning to write screenplays, and I wanted to read screenplays, that meant going to the library and taking out books, buying screenplays, right?
Yeah.
If you're lucky, the guy on the street with the table and the scripts laid out in the village might have one that you wanted. It's like, at the risk of sounding like an old man, it's like, it's so easy now, right? Like any script you want to read is 3 clicks away and you can read the script. And the more scripts you read, the more you are conversant with that blueprint, the more you're conversant with the language of what a script is supposed to look like, which is so important to kind of getting through that first hurdle of, is this a competent script? I know with the screenplay competition, and this is something that Annie and I have talked about a lot through the years of that, is that's the first step for me, right? In other words, if the script doesn't have the most basic craft of what goes into a screenplay, it's going to immediately start down in the hole, because that's a huge thing to overcome.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, moving on to the actual substance then. So turning you around because I'm sure you read other people's screenplays from time to time, and everything. What is it that you find are some of the from the positive end, what are the important things that you need to see craft-wise in a good script? And from the negative side, what do you see people doing wrong that needs to be better?
I mean, not to go technical in this forum.
Go a little technical.
Well, I mean, things like passive voice throughout the entire script, where the character doesn't really have a purpose or doesn't really have a clear intent of what they want or where they're going, and things that happen meanderingly, where they don't specifically tie into something else or move the story forward. So if I read 5 pages, and if I can look at those 5 pages and delete them from the script and it wouldn't matter, that's a problem. Every page needs to be so important that if you pull that page out of the script, the whole story falls apart. So if I can go through and be like, well, I didn't need to read that, that's a problem. So that's probably the most important thing I look for, is to make sure that every single piece of storytelling is required, you know, and delete the rest. And that's kind of cliche to say that, but it's so important, especially if something that's going to be turned into a movie, because all of those things are going to be deleted in the editing room. If it's not, you know, specifically serving a purpose, it's going to come out. And so if half your script is like that, you don't have a movie. Hopefully they'll realize that before they start shooting, but with a lot of modern movies, you can see the detail.
Because there's less of a bar to starting financially.
Yeah.
No, it's true. About 20 years ago, a friend of a friend asked if I would read his script, and he had never made a film before, so he had never been in an editing room or anything. And he had this central scene, which was, and this is not an exaggeration, 15 pages long of two people talking in a car. And I said to him, have you ever sat and tried to edit a scene together of two people talking and not moving? And he's like, no. I'm like, you need to take 13 of these 15 pages away, right? This is not something that actually, and I remember he said to our friend, it's like, oh, he's old school. He doesn't know what things are going to be like in the future or whatever. And I'm like, I'm quite sure that nobody's going to want to sit and watch 15 pages of two people talking together. You know, it's like, it's the idea exactly what Stevan just said. Like each action has to somehow drive the plot forward. As I say that, I'm thinking of one of my favorite movie scenes of all time is the mound scene in Bull Durham. Mm-hmm. And the studio tried to cut that because they said it didn't move the plot forward. But the point that Ron Shelton made was, that is the plot of the movie. The plot of the movie is about the relationships and what relationships are like at this very specific world of minor league baseball and everything. Yeah. And you learn more from that scene than you do from any other scene. So in that kind of sense it does. You have to look at it that way. But whatever your guiding light is, whether you're making a kind of quirky movie like that, that's based on this, showing you this world, or you're making a more traditional movie that has a more traditional plot sequence, there could be no extraneous material. Everything has to be.
Yeah, and to kind of springboard off of what he just said, you can have a story that takes place in one room with people just talking for 90 minutes. You can do that. As long as what they're talking about, each thing that they say moves the story forward. A perfect example is like 12 Angry Men. You know, it's just 12 guys in a room, but every block of conversation takes the story in a totally new direction. And you know, so you can do it, but again, it's all got to matter.
Well, the writing there, though, makes it so it's not just two people talking to each other for 15 pages. Because you're shifting between the different characters. Right. People are getting up and moving around the room. Yeah. There's got to be an element of action. It's a motion picture, right? You know what I mean? Right. There's got to be motion, or else it's not a motion picture, right? So even 12, if you watch 12 Angry Men, yes, it's very stagey, and yes, it's one location, and yes, it's 12, yes, and yes, talking in a room, but the stakes are so high, right? And each character is exhibiting throughout the script, very slowly revealing who they are and what they bring to the discussion. Right. So you are never thinking, I'm watching two people speak for 15 pages. You're constantly being moved on.
Yeah, every piece of dialogue in that film moves it forward.
Absolutely. Really, and the direction is like Sidney Lumet. I mean, it's you know, it's just right up the top. All right, so that's what else do you see positively, negatively? What are in good scripts or what are in bad scripts that immediately stand out to you besides that extra fat of scenes that don't matter?
Certainly original voice.
So let's talk about that a minute. What do you mean by that?
Well, just, you know, there's a lot of cliches in screenwriting, and if you can try to avoid that, try to always push yourself to do something that you haven't really seen before, if you can. Because the cliches will take the reader out. So original voice, where I feel like I'm reading something for the first time and experiencing something for the first time, and it's something unique and original. I think, like, look at what just happened this weekend with like Oppenheimer opening up, right? And it did really, really well. And you've got these other big films like Indiana Jones that should have done well and didn't. And why is that? Because I think what people are excited about with Oppenheimer is like, wow, this is really a subject that I really haven't paid much attention to in my life, and this is a story that I've never seen before by a great director. So yeah, it's something new and original, right? And that's what you want. You want that joy of discovery when you read something new. You don't want to be like, oh, I've seen that a million times before. You know, you want to try and avoid that. So that's something that I look for. Is when I say original voice, that's what I mean.
And it's interesting because in the screenplay competition, that's a lot of notes that will pass back and forth. You know what I mean? What about this script? I've seen that before. And I think one thing to maybe put a little pressure off of you guys, because it sounds like we're putting pressure on you to find something original. Finding something original doesn't necessarily mean it's a topic that no one has tackled before. Oftentimes it just means giving a fresh view or a fresh voice or a fresh twist or, on something that we've seen before, right? It's not, it's not like there's a shortage of like crime movies or police movies or dramas about romance or someone dying or a teacher and students, like all these themes we've seen 1,000 times. But what makes the good ones good, what's original about the voice, isn't, yes, it's another movie about a teacher with the students, but this one is different because of X, right? And doesn't that element doesn't have to be that big to make it fresh, right? It doesn't. You don't have to think you have to write something crazy that no one's ever seen before, like the first time you looked at like Pulp Fiction or something like that. It just has to be a fresh take on a traditional genre, and then that would work as well.
That's probably the most important thing said today. What you just said, absolutely, yeah. Because all the stories have been told. It's just how you tell them. Telling it in a different way.
Yeah. And one thing I think it's related to that, it's slightly different. The other comment to go with, I've seen the story before, is I don't know what the story is yet. So in other words, when I'm reading a script, if I don't know by page 3 or 4 what the story is, and I don't mean that I know how it's going to end, don't misunderstand me, but that I know who's the main character and what the journey is going to be about, so I can start locking in to follow that journey, right? And one note I make of a lot when I'm reading for the competition, and then also I used to make when I was reading in development, was I would put notes in the margin. Page 15, still don't know what the movie's about. Page 20, still don't know what the movie's about. Page 60, still don't know what the movie's about. And there was a good script that we got this year that in a lot of ways could have been the winning script. And the reason why it didn't win, because I was on page 120 and I still didn't know what the movie was about.
Wow.
It was a good script in a lot of ways, don't get me wrong. It was a really good script. I think that's going to be a good movie someday. I believe in that script. But as currently constituted I wasn't sure what that movie was about. There was another movie that by the end I didn't know who the main character was, right? Like these are things that seem so simple, but you need to make a choice as a writer to make sure that that comes through.
Yeah, I call that sharpening the stick. You want a nice sharp stick when you give your script to somebody who wants to go right through them. You don't want a blunt object. You want a nice sharp stick, and that's what you're doing as you're going through and honing your craft and whittling away at your screenplay. Each day you work on it, you're sharpening that stick.
It's a very dark but effective.
Well, I'm a hard writer.
That's true. That's right. I should have known that. What about dialogue? How do you approach dialogue?
It's weird for me because when I read dialogue that I've written that doesn't work, I get this weird sensation, this weird feeling in my stomach that something's wrong. I don't necessarily know what it is. I just know that it doesn't work. It happens with story structure too, but a lot with dialogue. So for me, it's more of like an intuition kind of thing when I'm writing of what I think those characters would say. So I don't hear characters like talking in my head. Like that doesn't happen to me. Yeah, that's probably the hardest part for me is getting the dialogue nuanced and accurate for what those characters would be saying in that moment and how they would say it, because that's really important, is how they would deliver a line. And just does it match the character that I have established throughout? Like on page 65, based on what you know on this character, would they say that in this moment that's happening? And those are all the things that go through my head as I'm writing.
Mastering the voice of the characters.
Yeah, it just has to ring true. Yeah, and that's so hard to do.
Yeah, Lauren Paul Kaplan, who usually does this panel, he had to go out to LA for meetings, so it's a good reason to miss. He's still involved in everything. He wrote a book about dialogue, and I remember when they first approached him to write the book, he's like, how do you, like, it's so much of it is instinctual, but he kind of broke it down, and I think he did a good job with it. One thing for me is, the biggest mistake I see newer screenwriters make is exposition and dialogue. Like that's the biggest mistake, and it's so hard not to do that when you're starting to learn to tell stories. I'm very sympathetic. It's like, because you think you're telling the story through the dialogue, but ultimately the story has to be told through the actions. And I think when you have expositional dialogue, the damage of that is it pulls you out of the script because it's not real to what the characters would be saying.
Right.
I think that's really the key. You don't have to feel like the pressure to write dialogue like you're Tarantino or any of these other like people who are known for great dialogue. I think the key is just is to make it the way people would actually speak and not worry about whether to find more effective ways to get things out there that you need to get out there.
Yeah, that's important. Sometimes it's what the character doesn't say that tells you a lot. You know, in a movie, you can have somebody enter a room, and just by the way the other person in the room turns and looks at that person can tell you so much more than if they actually said something, just the look in their eyes. That's hard to capture in a script, but you have to start to think about how you can do that, because if you just throw dialogue at everything, it becomes sort of redundant, and it loses its power and effect, especially on screen. I've learned that the hard way. I just finished directing a new film, and there was some dialogue that I had written in the script that I thought was, I won't get into it, but I thought it was just brilliant. And then when we went to shoot the scene, I was listening to them say it, and I'm like, this doesn't work at all. Like I thought it was brilliant, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't ring true, and it actually sounded really stupid. Like it was great in my head, but now hearing the characters say it, I'm like, I gotta literally rewrite this scene. We shut everything down, and I stopped for half an hour, and the way I fixed it was I took all the dialogue out, and it was like 10 lines became like 2 lines, and then it worked. And I realized that a lot of it should have just been implied, and some of it had already been said, whether it was through dialogue or just through action, and then it worked. But yeah, it's a difficult process. Yeah.
I think what you just said speaks to another thing you learn with experience, which is the confidence to let the audience figure stuff out. In other words, not every piece of exposition needs to be in the script. If you get a general idea from the way the story is structured, the way the character is drawn, the way people speak, you can get an idea generally of what you were trying to get through in that specific that's more effective. People can figure out that someone, came from a rural background and isn't used to being in the city or whatever without saying, I grew up in an exurb. You know what I mean? Like the way they do the things they do, the way they approach something can tell so much more than the dialogue that says, well, I grew up 3 hours outside of the city, right? Right. Which no one would ever say, right? Yeah.
And then you'll find that balance, and you'll find your voice as you write, as you continue. I mean, you don't want to go the opposite spectrum and like Shane Carruth it, where you basically force the audience to write the script for you because you don't reveal anything about anything. But you'll find that balance, that'll make sense to you as you develop as a writer.
Balance, that's a key word. One more question before we open up to Q&A, and I think it's interesting having you on this panel, is that as we all know, the film world has changed so much, right? So I said 22 years ago, I was the opening night film. That was a film that was shot on film, right?
What year was that?
2001.
Okay, I came here in 2003. Was it 2003?
God,
that was 20 years ago.
Yeah. So, but it's and I always tell the story that I shot it on film, and by the time I got to the festival circuit, I only screened on film, I think 3 times that year. One of them was here. But everyone else is like, oh great, you shot on film. It's like, get me a beta cassette, or it was always already on to something else.
I get PTSD just hearing beta.
Yeah, I know. And so things have changed so much, and the business changed so much. The other thing about it from that time that's changed, and 20 years isn't that long, is that if you had asked me on set, who are the companies that you want to distribute this movie, they're all gone now, for the most part, right? And the entire way, and then they said, well, what would be your main thing? I said, I think this will do well on DVDs, right? A dead genre, right? So it's like technology, not genre. So the point I'm making is, in such a short time for the industry to completely change, right? It's interesting to me that you have found a way to make multiple films with distribution through the thing that works for you, right? So I think people often ask, how do I get my script to an agent? How do I get my script read at a studio or whatever? And I think a better question in 2023 is how can you forge your way with your writing. And so for someone who's done it so successfully on his own, what advice would you give to someone?
Oh man, well, that's a whole nother panel.
Yeah. Well, 5 minutes.
All right. Well, I guess how would I approach that? If I was, starting out today, what do I? The real big difference now is there's no barrier to entry, right? Anybody can make a filmmaker. Like right now, I'm a filmmaker, right? To give you an idea of how powerful this is, right? This is an iPhone 14. So we were up in Maine shooting my film. We just finished shooting in May, and we were shooting on the Alexa, and it's like a $100,000 camera. And there was a morning where we had wrapped shooting, and the camera is such a big, bulky monster that to get it set up and ready to shoot is such a process. It's like 30 minutes. It's like, fuck it. I'm going to shoot this with my phone. The sun was coming up, and it was absolutely gorgeous. It was like 4 a.m. and the sun's coming up in Maine, right? Because we're so high up. And I was like, I have to get this. And so I just whipped out my phone. I shot it in 4K. And when I went back into the editing room recently, I was like, oh, I got that shot. I want to see what it looks like. And I edited it into the film, and fuck you, you can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference. I put it through some noise reduction, and it looks amazing. And once they color correct it, it's going to look even better. So there you go, right?
$1,000 camera.
Versus, and it looks, it's one of the best shots in the movie, and I shot it on this. So there's no barrier to entry. You can just whip out your phone, and now you're a filmmaker, right?
Except, not everybody is going to make a good film.
Well, that's the rub, right? It's not about can you do it. It's all about can you tell a good story. Anybody can shoot a movie, but how many people can actually tell a coherent story for 90 minutes and keep an audience's attention? That's really, really hard, and 99.9999999% of filmmakers out there can't do it. That's why it's so hard to break into this business, because the people who are the gatekeepers, they, not the corporate heads, but the people below them who actually know what they're doing and look at this stuff in acquisitions, know what a good film is. And it doesn't matter how great it looks, does not matter. You can shoot it in black and white, ask Aronofsky, right? You can shoot in black and white, doesn't matter. If it's a good story, that's what matters. And there's very few storytellers out there, very, very few. And that's what you need to strive to be. Today, that's what you need to be. It's not about the technical aspects. Like 25, 30 years ago, there was such a discipline to making a film, and there were very much less films being made, that it was different. Like when I shot my first film, I shot it on 35, even though everybody else was doing digital around that time. The DVX 100 was blowing up, right? And I shot a film for $200,000 on 35, and we were only able to do 1 or 2 takes per scene. So it's a lot of master shots in my movie. But the beauty of it is, when it was done, I would call all the distributors and say, hey, I have a film I'd love to show you. Whatever. But it's shot on 35. Oh, really? And it got them to come down, because it showed that there was a discipline and financing behind my film to get it made. So it made it like a professional movie, and I got a lot of companies to come down. We eventually signed a deal. Today, there's really, like it used to be, if you could shoot a film really cheap, that was like a badge of honor. Now it just shows that you're not trying, right? It's like, oh, nobody cared, right? Nobody cared to give you any money because your script probably sucked. So it's not a badge of honor anymore. So it's like, how do you get people interested to see your work? Well, even if you shot it on film, I don't think that really matters. And nothing really matters, and you're not going to shoot it on film anymore.
Why would you?
I mean, good luck finding a negative cutter today, right?
Sorry.
So
I had
how do you
finding one 20 years ago.
Yeah, right. So how do you stand out? There's only one way, and that is by telling a good story. So it doesn't matter what you shoot it on, as long as people are watching it and interested and want to know what happens next. Because as soon as they check out, you're done.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking, and what's interesting is that obviously so much has changed. I started my question off by saying so much has changed, right? How everything in the world, using my movie as an example, has changed. The companies are gone, the medium is gone, the process was different, everything is completely different.
Yeah.
But I think one thing has stayed the same, and that is that there's a shortage, and I remember an agent that I was friendly with telling me this, there's a shortage of good stories. There's a shortage of people who have interesting things to say and to say them in an interesting way.
And if you want proof of that, look at how many sequels are going around right now. There's very few original ideas that are being floated in Hollywood.
And I think that what that links to me is something that I've seen over the years, which is I think that it's hard for writers to accept the fact that it takes time and work and writing a lot of scripts to get better. And I think that people think their stuff is ready before it's ready. And I think that hasn't changed in 20 years. I think that like the best advice to give someone is, like, if they, how do I get this to an agent? I turn the question around and say, is it ready for an agent? How do you know it's ready for an agent, right? How many have you written? Like, you know, what have you done to see if this is at the level that it's ready? Because I am a believer, and people can laugh at me if they want, if you write a truly great script, if you write a truly great story with good characters and good dialogue, it will get found. It's not a matter of how do you find the agent or find the studio.
Right.
As long as you make some effort to put it into the world, it will be found, because there are so few of them. They're unicorns, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the way to get seen or to get found or get discovered is to become the best writer that you can possibly become, and oftentimes that means understanding that your first script and maybe your second script and maybe your third script aren't really at the level yet that people should be looking at, right?
Yeah.
And I was, it's now 7 years ago, I was moving and I found an old box with the second script I ever wrote. And I started flipping through it and I started getting physically ill. Oh my God, this is awful. Like, what was I thinking? This is like a disgrace. And it was awful. But if you asked me at the time,
Right.
This is the way it is.
Yeah.
You know.
I think every writer has that experience going back through their old work. Yeah. And it's like, it's cliche, but think of it like a wine. Like if you had a wine from 20 years ago or a wine from last year, which one would you rather drink if you had the choice, right? You'd want the old wine, right? So take time with your script, let it ferment, let it, grow into something great, and that it takes time.
and yourself to ferment also.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that first one's probably never going to be.
I mean, you can always strike gold. I mean, who knows? There's always beginner's luck.
Right.
But it's, it's rare. I mean, even still, even if it's your first script, if you spend several years on it, or if you spend a lot of time and you really, really work on it, yeah, it could become something great. You never know.
I guess so.
I don't want to discourage anyone.
That's true.
You have to write 10 scripts in order to make a good one. Like, there's a lot of, first timers out there, who get lucky, but it's rare. This is a very difficult discipline. Yeah.
Take it seriously and learn your craft. That's the best advice.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sure you have questions. Questions for Steven? Yeah.
So I'll tell you a little about my journey, and my question is not how to, because I've written 3 feature screenplays. Right off the bat, I said to myself, I need to write treatments, I need to hire a writing partner, and I actually had a writing room which I paid my writers, okay, on all 3 scripts. Also had a short here in the festival a couple of years ago. So my idea was that, well, if you don't know how to make a film, even a short, you're not going to write a good script. You're just not going to do this. So let's assume that you've written the script. I put it through screenplay consultants who charge anywhere from $600 to $1,500, 3 rounds, spent probably $20,000 or $30,000 getting into film and making it, okay? So now what intrigued me about what you said in your intro, my writers and I and the team were kind of like, okay, let's resurrect the first script because that was the original good idea. But they just become tired. We've all become tired. So I happen to work for Barnes & Noble. I'm one of the junior executives there, and I said, well, you know what? Our on-ramps are hard in 2023 because even with a reviewed screenplay and a consulted screenplay and many, many revisions, there's no, except for stage, I think it's called stage 32, where junior executives are reading your scripts and present themselves as an on-ramp to studios. It's very hard to get past any gatekeepers at all, or even discover an on-ramp into having your script considered. So what I said, let's reverse adapt, which is with your introduction, our first screenplay back into a novel. We'll self-publish it. I'll fund the self-publishing, which is going to be vastly cheaper than that, marketing aside. And we're in the process of doing that. We're about 2/3 done, as well as rewriting the weak parts we thought might exist. So the idea here is that the readership might achieve if you market it right and you self-publish, because the big three publishing companies are probably, because I know them, they're worse than the big six. All right, as far as being a gatekeeper, publishing is not what it was, if it ever was that. So I'd like to ask you if the strategy of telling the studio, you have a novel, it's out there, maybe it's got 5,000 to 10,000 readership, is in any way going to be a better deal because you've qualified your IP, you have a story, you have a readership. Is that going to be any better strategy than trying to push through it directly to the gatekeepers?
Well, there's one hole in your strategy. The problem is when you self-publish, no one will review your book. It's a written rule in publishing.
Yes.
And so if you don't have legitimate reviews from legitimate reviewers, it's like you don't exist. And so because you self-published, it doesn't have the validity of being a published work. So I would say the only way that strategy would be successful is if you were able to get it through a legitimate publisher, get legitimate reviews, and then say, hey, look at this reviewer who has reviewed all these books for the New York Times, look what they said about this book. Then maybe there's some kind of weight to it. But without that, it's an uphill.
So you're still up against the gatekeepers with a query synopsis, trying to get that your novel read instead of a script.
Yeah. It's really that you still haven't validated the work, and the only way to do that is to have legitimate reviewers say, yeah, I read it, it was good.
The other hole that I thought of, from your point of view, this is a different type of hole, is that, so let's say your strategy works. Let's say Disney sees the book and goes, oh wow, we could see making a series off of this. They're just going to buy it from you. They're not going to let you write it. They're not going to let you direct it, right?
Right, but you can't go and say, well, I had a screenplay, it's all done.
They're going to be like, we don't care.
Yeah, well, that's the other problem.
And they're going to go one of the
of
6 writers that they trust, and they're going to, you see what I'm saying?
They'll do that anyway, whether you have a novel or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. But at least you'd have some writers guild rules if they use any of your stuff of a screenplay, they would have to give you credit for it.
Yeah. Breaking in is hard no matter how you do it. And if you, you're going to spend a lot of money no matter what. The idea of the lone screenwriter by himself in a room trying to get something read, and you're right, you will never get your first script read, even your 10th script.
That's not true. I'll give you an example. Okay, so when I wrote a screenplay called Transients back in 2010, I sent it to someone who had tried to hire me as a director for a really, really bad movie. These are the guys who produced the Final Destination films. And so I sent the script to them. They loved it and they wanted to buy it from me. And I said, no, I'm going to direct this myself. This is going to be, like the next evolution in my career. And so they said, okay, and they ended up stealing the script and turning it into a TV show. So rather than just pay me and whatever and work with me, they just took that.
They pushed you aside.
So, I won't go into the whole detail of it, but what I ended up doing was, because of all that happened, that IP was kind of worthless now. So I'm like, what am I going to do with this story? Because it's still a great story. So I turned it into a novel, and I put it in just to do it, right? I turned it into a novel just to do it, because I had no other avenue to make a movie out of it now. And I put it in a drawer, and that was 2013. 2015, I took it out of the drawer and I read it. I'm like, this isn't bad. It's actually a pretty good story. And I asked a few people who I knew in the industry who had published many books, and I said, what can I do with this? And they're like, well, nothing, because you'll never find an agent. I'm like, okay. So what do I do? They're like, just put it back in the drawer. I'm like, really? I'm like, the odds are that bad? They're like, yeah. I'm like, all right, you know what? I'm just gonna, and I downloaded this thing online that showed different literary agents, and I literally sent it to the first one on the list, the agency group, and
the novel.
The novel. Well, no, I sent you send like the first 3 chapters.
Yeah.
And a month later, the secretary of one of the agents contacted me and said, "Could you send the full book?" I was like, "Oh, yeah, okay." I sent her the book. I get a call the next day from Juliet Mushins, who's one of the top agents in the world. She's based in the UK. Says to me, Steven, this is the best thing I've read in 10 years. And I want to sign you immediately. And I'm going to sell this for millions of dollars. I got off the phone like, well, that happened. Everybody told me that I knew I could get an agent. I got one of the top agents in the world on the first try. So we edited the book, over, Skype for about a month, and she got it where she thought, there's a few things she wanted to add to it. So I actually added a chapter for her, and then it went out, and it sold in Germany, and it sold in Italy, and it sold in South America. Wow. The only place it didn't sell was the United States, because Warner Brothers says, well, hey, we had a lawsuit against this, and so we couldn't sell it here because the IP was all tied up in litigation. So my dreams of, becoming a billionaire off the book went up in smoke. Anyway, don't feel sorry for me. The point I'm trying to make is that, don't let people discourage you that your first thing or whatever can't succeed. If the writing is good, it will succeed. That's all that matters. I had never written a novel before. I rarely even read books. I maybe read 10 books my whole life.
Yes.
And I'm a published novelist. And if it wasn't for fucking Warner Brothers, I probably would have had a best-selling book.
So you would still
Here.
advise that it's a strategy, not the best, not the worst, but a strategy to push your novel.
No, what I'm saying is writing well is a strategy.
Oh, of course, right. Yeah,
If you
but
wanna
that's
be
always a strategy.
If you want to
no
be a
matter what you're
novelist,
writing.
write a novel. If you don't want to be a novelist and you want to be a screenwriter, write screenplays.
Right.
Okay.
That's what I would say.
Right.
It's like these back-end kind of ways could work, but I am very much of the, and again, if you want to call me a Pollyanna, it's like if you write a great script with a great story and great characters, people will want to see it.
But it is the story, really. It's the story people want because you just said that, there's unique stories that are great are what we start with. We all start with, no matter what form it is.
And by the way, when we talk about peak TV now and all these great cable and streaming shows, they all have great stories.
Oh, they
great characters
yeah.
with really interesting stories, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. That's where the storytelling has kind of moved because movies have changed to Marvel movies and things like that, right? So, yeah. All right, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about narration? Like in terms of having a character for like exposition, like narrate something. Do you feel like that's more like a cop out, or do you feel like it can be used in a very helpful way?
I mean, it depends on the type of story. It's actually sometimes it can be a really great way to get insight into a character. I think as long as it's not overused, then it's good. Especially like look at what's that movie? The Big Lebowski that starts out with the narration in the beginning. It's not a lot, but it's just enough to get you embedded in the story and kind of just set the world up for you. And sometimes narration helps with that. Instead of a montage, you just give a narration. But yeah, as long as it's not overused, my opinion.
Yeah. So, can the answer be both? Because honestly, like in the film that opened up here starts with a narration, and that's because my first act was too long and terrible, and we had to fix it in editing, and that's how we figured out how to do it. It wasn't in the script. I have seen brilliant scripts that brilliantly use voiceovers. To me, the rule is that it should be integrated into the story in the script. In other words, you can't just have narration because there's narration. But like if you think about, what was that, I didn't see the movie, but it's a famous, I think the story about where the victim of the crime narrates the movie.
The Lovely Bones?
That's what I was thinking, right, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's
Brilliant.
a reason why there's voiceover. It's because the character is dead and is telling the story, right? That is not a cop-out. That is it goes back to, people are going to throw things at me. If you write a good script with good characters and good stories, people will care. That's because that's good writing.
It's not a subtle point you're making.
What did he mean by this? So that would be my answer to the question. Is it good writing? If it's good writing, you can do it. If it's, a bad filmmaker botching his first act and having to put a voiceover in so that it makes some sense, that's not advisable. Right?
The person who tells the story has to be an integrated character, like the deceased or
Right. The person
a
doesn't have to be-
friend or something.
Right, and why are they telling the story?
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
there's what's the
I knew my neighbor next door, and he was a murderer.
right? What's the is it? Oh crap! My brain doesn't work like it used to. Where the person's narrating the story, and you're wondering why that person's narrating the story, but then by the second act climax, you realize, oh, this is the person, right? Which is a very difficult thing to pull off, but that's why they were narrating. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, that's not a cop-out. That's real. It's that movie, I know what it was.
The Usual Suspects?
No, it's the newer movie. It's the one about the three friends. It's the one with Jesse Eisenberg. It's the TV show. It's not a movie.
Third Dame Song?
No, it's the TV with Jesse Eisenberg and oh man, it's the one where it's
Fleischman and Trouble?
yes, that one.
Fleischman and Trouble,
Where
yeah.
you're wondering why is the Lizzie
narrating.
Kaplan character narrating this?
Right.
It looked like a cop out, but then you realize, oh my God, she's the protagonist, right? Now I don't know how I felt about that, but that was a decision and that was integrated. That was not a cop out, right? That's good writing. So.
That actually works better in the novel. So
I didn't read the
read
novel,
the novel
so.
first when I saw the TV out of it, and then it makes more, it felt very artificial for me in terms of the television version as opposed to the novel.
I didn't love the show.
No.
The acting was great. I thought all the actors were really good. But so, does that answer your question, Em?
Yeah.
Or is that a cop out? Yeah.
I'm sort of under the impression that maybe years ago when the business was different and there was different distribution and so forth, that screenwriters at some point would often get asked, who's the audience going to be for this story, this script? And I'm wondering, is that still a thing?
Absolutely.
Do people ever get asked that? And whether or not, you know, the screenwriter gets asked that by somebody else, is it a good question for them to ask themselves? Do you ever think about it? You know, like, who's your audience?
I don't know if we agree on this.
Um,
I say absolutely. You can't write a script without knowing who the audience is and expect to sell it, right? And even now, especially because everything is so niche. So now, if you know, there's very little mass audience anymore. So who are you? Who is this for, right? Even on Netflix, because of the algorithms, there are specific types. There's many different types of things on Netflix because it's huge. But there are lines. If you watch this, we're going to show you this next, right? And it's like you need to be able to tell Netflix this fits into this progression.
It's
right?
almost like with published books, bookstores, when they used to be around, they'd want to know what shelf
Right.
to put the book on.
They do.
But I have a feeling you're going to disagree with me, aren't you?
you know, I was just trying to come up with a clever metaphor. And the best I can come up with is like when you're hungry and you ask everybody like, what do you guys feel like eating? You know, you say, well, let's go for Italian, or let's go for, you know, Chinese, or let's go for whatever. You know, it's genres of food. It's kind of the same thing with movies. You know, I mean, you don't necessarily sit there and go, well, let's go to the movies. Well, would you like to see a horror movie? Would you like to see a thriller? You know, but you kind of know what you like, and those movies know what they are. You know, it's kind of like what he was saying about, like, as you're reading a script, as you know where the story's going and what it's about. You know, you should know what your story is, and you know, it can't be ambiguous. It's got to be specific.
But it sounds like, for you personally, you don't generally think in terms of an audience.
I mean, I'm not making a film and sitting there thinking like, well, who's going to be the audience for this? Who's going to want to watch this? But at the same time, it has to be in the back of your mind. You know, it doesn't have to be the driving force, but, you know, I don't want to make the whole art versus commerce argument. I mean, that's been done to death, but if you want to sell it, you're going to have to at some point say, like you know, when you're looking for films on like Prime Video and it says like horror, thriller, like you search for a film like under comedy, like there's all these like categories and they're categorized. If you're like, I don't know where my movie fits, well then they don't, and nobody's ever gonna find it.
Yeah.
Or make it.
Yeah.
If you're looking for someone else to pay for it, right? You've got to give someone a line. You should make this movie because it'll be this type of movie that will appeal to this type of audience.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean to be why you're writing it. You can write it for your own reason, but you need to be aware that I'm writing a movie that fits in here. Because if it doesn't fit in anywhere, no one is going to fund it.
Yeah, and it's like,
No one's gonna buy it.
if you're making a comedy, just know that no one in Japan is going to buy your movie. You know, making a horror movie, yeah, but a comedy, no, it's not going to translate. So,
Language, culture. Humor is hard. It's not fair, but it's true.
I thought when you pitched, you still had the pitch outline, target audience, and you still have to do that because the studios just want to say, well, what is this?
Well,
You don't pitch to a studio that does horror, and you're going to pitch a rom-com to the...
Today more than ever, you need to know where that film is going to fit in, especially with streaming now. You've got to know. Like, it's more important that your thumbnail is eye-catching than anything else. Like, your movie doesn't even have to be good; it's got to have a good thumbnail.
Didn't they say that at like porn in the 80s or something?
Porn star, that's the benchmark. That's where everything starts. Everything else starts from that.
That's the first one. All right, last question from anyone?
What are you working on now?
Oh, great question.
That to me?
Yeah.
I'm working on a film called The Ruse. It's a whodunit.
Okay.
We just shot it in May, and I'm hoping to have it finished hopefully by the end of September, and maybe released sometime next year.
Do you have a distribution or have
Nope.
you plan yet?
No distribution in place. I have some ideas of where I'm going to go with it, but it was sort of an experimental film for me because it's different from a lot of the other stuff that I've done. So I wasn't quite sure if it's something that I could pull off. So far, it's looking like maybe I have, but I don't really know what I have yet. So until it's fully realized, then I'll know where it belongs. But it's still kind of a work in progress.
So you're producing and directing your own stuff?
Yeah.
You
That's good.
wrote it too?
Yeah.
Written, direct, produced.
That's
a powerful combination.
Yeah, I financed part of it, and I directed it, I wrote it, I'm editing it, I'm going to score it, so.
Wow, that's great.
I'm a control freak.
When I was writing, I hired a composer. One of the first things I did.
But I wouldn't do that. I've hired composers in the past, and I've thrown out everything they've given me. And
Oh no, not for the end, just for the inspiration.
I'm just a lunatic. But don't do as I say, not as I do.
Like takes us back to my Preston Whitmore story that started this. So it's a good way to put a thing. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and listening. We appreciate it. And thank you again to Annie and Henry and the Belmore Movies for sponsoring the food.
Where is Henry?